Hi, it's Martha Van Berkel, and this is SEO in 2025.
Martha, what's your number one SEO tip for 2025?
Well, it really is about people starting to think about entity SEO and managing their content knowledge graph.
Right, entity SEO. What would you say is the definition of an entity?
Oh, I always like to start to think about like an entity is like a thing, right? So when you're in a business, you think about the most important strategic things for the business. And what makes an entity different than a keyword or a word is it really is three-dimensional. Is that you're using things to describe that entity and how it relates to other things. And so, the language that we use to articulate what an entity is schema.org. And that vocabulary is really, really robust in having all those properties to describe what it's about. So I always think of, a keyword would be like one-dimensional, and an entity is really three-dimensional.
Okay. Do SEOs sometimes think that something's an entity, but it isn't actually an entity?
Probably. I think we really have to think like it has to have truly dimensions to it, right? Like it needs to have, in the schema.org, it's like properties, right? So it's not just like, a person, but a person has a name and, a background and an education, and they work for an organization. So they have all these parameters or things that allow us then to ask questions or make inferences, or have deeper understanding. And so I think when I think about, I always ask like organizations, like, well, what are your important entities? Like, these are the things they sell, their locations, their key executives in the business. Now, it could also be an asset, like it could be sort of talking about something. So it's a blog that's talking about, how all these things are connected, but it's likely not a sentence or just a word.
So I'm sure some SEO and content teams don't care about entities. Obviously, you'd say that's a mistake, but why should SEO and content teams care about entities?
The other way I always think about this is like, why have we started talking about entities? Like, why is this something we've defined over time? And I think the sort of reason, especially as we go into 2025, why this is most important is, large language models and, AI, it's not new anymore, right? Like this has been around since, for over a year, maybe even 2 years, depending on how far back you want to go and sort of how it's playing in our world. And entities are important in this new world. And why are they important? Because, with these large language models or AI driven search or ChatGPT, so I call that sort of AI search, like with this new landscape of search, they're getting smarter. And so while we historically would just be like, oh, well, we're going to trust Google to just understand and figure it out. They're the questions consumers are asking or people are asking or are much more complicated now. And the risk of getting them wrong, so all the evidence that, these large language models have hallucinations and, make wrong inferences, by managing your entities or, taking control of how you're describing them and standardizing on the languages that you use to describe them, which is what schema markup does, frankly reduces, those hallucinations, the likelihood of them getting wrong. But on the other side, it also like increases the confidence in those inferences and therefore should get you, more meaningful connections, more meaningful clicks, more meaningful traffic. And so I think historically where, people would be like, I don't need to read about entity SEO. I don't need to understand what a knowledge graph is. And I can define that in a minute. Like if you're not doing that now, I think you're really sort of starting to lag.
What is a knowledge graph?
So a knowledge graph is actually when you describe these entities and you make those connections. And the way I often explain it is sort of in how I introduce myself. So I've said my name is Martha. I'm an expert in schema markup. I'm the founder of Schema App. I'm Canadian. And I used to drive a 1965 Austin Healey Sprite. And my red sports car was in the movie called Losing Chase that Kevin Bacon directed. And so you can now, if in North America, we have a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon joke,
Yeah.
you can now figure that out or infer that you can win the Kevin Bacon game because you understand those relationships. Well, me describing who I am and all these connections is my knowledge graph. So if you then think of when you're describing entities, right, on your website or things in your business, and you're explaining how they're connected, this is the author of this blog, and this author works for this company, and this company sells this solution, and this blog is mentioning that solution. All of a sudden you can make more inferences. And there's quite a lot of data. The most recent article I read shows that you can boost accuracy of large language models by 300% if the data is in a knowledge graph versus in sort of a relational database. And to kind of bring that in the marketing terms, like if it's just in this CMS and just in sort of like basic structure, you're not going to get that accuracy that you could get if it was, if you're describing the entity in detail, if you're describing the relationships and building what I like to refer to as your content knowledge graph across your website. And so again, in this world of AI search, where we want to do both risk mitigation and opportunity optimization, we need to, as marketers, need to think differently about how we're sort of translating our data for machines and sort of controlling how we're defining those relationships.
So it's modern day PR and brand management.
It is, in one state, and then it also, helps with SEO. But it's also, I've talked about SEOs being the hero because by, doing really good entity optimization or schema markup sort of optimization across your site, you're also helping IT because you're building, if you do it well, you're building this content knowledge graph, which, I love Gardner called out in February that, like what are sort of 10 emerging technologies that are going to be really important for business decisions? Well, you can imagine all the CIOs in the companies or the head of IT are kind of understanding what are the technologies I should be investing in? Well, one was generative AI, not surprising. The second one that was most critical to invest in 2024 was knowledge graphs. So I think it's so cool that SEOs have this opportunity.
Is entity management just a done once and then forget about it activity?
I wish. So I think the thing that you have to remember is that with entity management, you can't just you're thinking of like an entity. And I tie like an entity home as a web page, right? So to kind of just simplify this, like when you're doing an entity management, like you're kind of like thinking about how are you translating and defining the entity that's contained in a web page, right? So it could be describing a product, for example. So just like you're managing the content on that site, you're also going to want to manage like how that entity is being defined in schema markup. So that's the standard vocabulary, right? That the search engines and other machines are using. And then the relationships. Now, what's important is that when that's done, if the relationships change, which happens, right? Like you need to keep that up to date because this is now not just like one and done. I'm translating it. They get it. This is like a living data source, right? Of how all the entities on your site relate to one another. And so that map is going to change. But what's great about it is if you're managing each page, right, or each entity on its own, because of the nature of how knowledge graphs are and that you're defining that relationship, as long as you're managing all the relationships, like the data is accurate and stays up to date.
So who should own the entity management task? I mean, should it be built into a marketing strategy? Is it part of the content team's activities?
It really is a collaborative effort. So this is again where I would say like the translation of it should sit in either sort of like a technical SEO person's role, but in strong partnership with IT so that they understand sort of what's there. But it's all derived from what content's on the page. And so it really is a collaborative effort between content teams, which are going to then work with the marketers, which is going to then work with IT, and then it's going to work with the technical SEO. So it's really together, they have to work through this, but it's often led by the technical SEO team.
Got you. Okay. So a technical SEO team might implement it or at least initiate the discussion about it. How should they train other teams about this? Because perhaps some other teams may not have heard of it. How do they articulate the value of doing this?
Yeah, so I think some of the Gartner research is really helpful because they're actually, speaking to different audiences. So especially for when we're talking to like the IT team or sort of technical teams, them understanding the importance of it. I do like Gartner Data and Analytics 2024 conference in London talked about like adding semantic integration of knowledge graph data, and sort of they talk about the standardization and the vocabulary of it. So they can kind of get educated reading kind of some of those pieces of it. Content teams, I love sort of the opportunity to explain that there's this vocabulary or a sort of dictionary of what machines want to know about certain topics. And actually, I've taken content teams to schema.org and said, oh, I'm so glad you're working on this physician profile, for example, for a healthcare organization. Here's all the things Google, Yahoo, and Bing want to know about a physician. And, is that data available? And like, is that important information for your consumers? And where's that happy medium between them, right? Because again, this is a data layer that's not visible by the consumers, but a lot of it requires it to be on the web page because that's where it's being derived sort of in that work. And so they'll often have a look at that and be like, oh, actually, like we have this information, like we should connect the dots to that as well. So this is again why it's a conversation of, it's not just for SEO's sake now, like it's going to get the rich result, but it's going to help a much broader machine understanding, which historically didn't exist.
So you touched upon why Entity SEO is important for AI. How do you measure the impact of that, and how do you optimize further to ensure that your brand, your entity is discovered within AI search?
Well, and this is new, right? So I know a lot of measurement platforms are now sort of just coming up with new ways to see how things are, I'll say, performing in this new world. So I would say like that part I have less commentary on because it's still so brand new as we record this. What we have been able to measure, though, is when you have a page that's speaking about an entity and it's been optimized and connected well within the content knowledge graph, a lot of the historical measures around queries and query data sort of that mentions specific entities, we have seen sort of after this is done well, that we can actually see an increase in click-through rate for non-branded versions of that sort of entity. So kind of living in our SEO metrics world, we have been able to see sort of if, let's say, there's another part of Entity SEO that's around disambiguation. So you're sort of describing things, but then you're also clarifying what they are. So this means kind of connecting them to definitions, whether that be your own definition, your own taxonomy or glossary, or on Google's knowledge graph or Wikidata. We have seen when, let's say in the local space, if you disambiguate locations very specifically in context of the thing you're talking about. So it could be a location, a local business, a product offering, queries like near me, or that mention that specific location. We've seen increase in click-through rate for non-branded queries after we've done that work. So we have seen that as like a specific measure. I do know there's other tools out there that are starting to talk about like, well, let's look at how well you're clustering around that specific topic or around that entity. Specifically at Schema App, like we're actually working on enabling content teams to be able to see how often they're talking about entities, like what the coverage is. But this is a whole new area, I'll say, of marketing, because I do think it's much broader than just SEO. And I know, like as we get more data from, I'll say, the ChatGPTs, the Google SGEs of the world, that we can then merge into that, how often are we show up in AI overviews? We'll know whether we're actually, we as marketers are being effective, in the work that we're doing. But I think it's pretty early days yet.
If an SEO is struggling for time, what should they stop doing right now so they can spend more time thinking about Entity SEO in 2025?
Oh, what should you stop doing? I think the piece is like, stop just hunting for keywords and start really thinking about writing around topics, or sort of, again, writing helpful content that explores that kind of three-dimensional view. What is the thing and how does it connect, instead of just changing words in and out?
Does keywords not come before topics?
Yes, keywords are sort of, I would say, like that sort of most base structure that then need to kind of be grouped together and in more context in order to become a topic or an entity.
Got you. Martha Van Berkel is CEO at Schema App, and you can find her over at schemaapp.com. Martha, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2025.
Thanks so much for having me.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2025, the book, over at seoin2025.com.